I'll close the poll straight away. Right, so you can see the full set of slides here. So we're talking about design thinking. And this is just a bit of overview of the overall structure of the content we have today. This is a big set of slides, and there's also a lot this week in terms of supplementary materials, as I mentioned in my email to you, your message to you earlier. There's the very valuable material that is from the D School, and I'll pull that up a little bit somewhat later on. And there's a couple of good TED Talks from David Kelly. David Kelly, along with his brother, key pioneers in promoting design thinking, both as consultants through owning IDEO and in also establishing the D School, the design school, at Stanford University. And what is very distinctive about the D School at Stanford is that it's a very strong sense that people benefit from design thinking, and design thinking can change the world in positive ways. And so that's one reason why they make their teaching methodologies, their design thinking methodologies available to the world at large. Of course, Stanford, unless you've got a scholarship, costs an absolute fortune to go to, $60,000 a year or something. But they put a lot of this material out there because they really do think that it can change the world in a positive way. They want a whole bunch of people in developing countries, whether it's NGOs, UN agencies, school teachers in suburbs with very few resources, and this includes within the United States, because there's huge inequalities in terms of funding of education and whatnot. They really want people to use these design thinking methodologies and really make the most of them. So it's very much that act of faith that this is a good thing that should be shared, and you can change the world through design thinking. A whole bunch of companies, of course, have realized that this is really good material and you can get it for free. Of course, the ugly side of this is that there are a whole lot of spivs. There's a whole bunch of consultants who have jumped onto this. They've got the material for free and they're now selling themselves as design thinking experts. And you're probably only about 5 slides behind them, okay? So it's something that's good for you to really engage with. I think you can use it in terms of your shoe cuts, because a lot of companies are very much interested in it these days. It's very rarely taught, even actually in typical kind of gay day arts programs and whatnot. When they have design programs, it's imbued in everything, the whole approach to design in design programs, normally tied to a particular field, whether it's interior design, whether it's architecture, whether it's product design, for example. So there's less in the way of a generalized conversation about what design is relative to other academic fields. They kind of take it for granted, in the same way that most of the professors in SILS just make certain assumptions about knowledge fields and appropriate forms of knowledge and appropriate means of testing that knowledge. There's a whole lot of unspoken assumptions. So this comes down to basic assessment design issues. You know, for example, we have in SILS a mechanism for the Sotsudon, for the graduation thesis, to be a graduation project, something other than a pure thesis. And one of my very nice colleagues in the economics and business cluster sent an email out a couple of days ago saying, SILS is just rewriting this policy and they're going to further liberalize it and encourage people to do this. And I thought, this is a great thing. And then his line says, I don't think this is relevant to any of you in economics and business, but anyway, seeing I'm on the curriculum committee, I thought I'd better just tell you. I immediately wrote back saying that's enormously relevant to me. About a third of my students choose to do a very significant creative or art or design project in place of a large part of their thesis. And you know, of course, they submit a diary of inquiry or a reflective mini thesis that goes alongside it. There's always a text that goes with it, but they're not just doing a thesis. And he replied saying, wow, okay, I had no idea that anyone was doing that anywhere. So that was kind of nice, but it also reminded me that particularly from an economist perspective, they have a certain sense of a knowledge field, how that knowledge is taught, and how that knowledge is tested in various forms, in written and examination form, and whatnot. So we'll talk about some of these basic issues of design as problem solving, but problem solving is not enough. And one of the supreme ironies is that there's been big debates in Japan about reforming university education. And one of the hot topics has been, big issues has been critical thinking and problem solving skills. And Waseda talks a lot about this, and Sills talks a lot about it. Actually, it's really out of date, because the conversation has kind of moved on in the last decade, at least. It's much less about problem solving and critical thinking. We take that for granted, of course. What's the point of going to university for 4 years if you can't have problem solving skills? But the reasons why people focused on that in the past, of course, was just testing a field of knowledge. But problem solving skills are important. But more important in a rapidly changing world is actually problem discovery and problem defining. There's the famous quote from Henry Ford that he said, if I went and asked customers what they'd want, they would have said a faster horse. And Steve Jobs and other people have commented on this, that the real challenge in business is not to take an existing problem that customers tell you they have, but to actually tell them they've got a problem they didn't even realize they have a problem, to actually discover problems. The very nature of the iPhone, for example, is about getting 3 or 4 stages ahead of everyone else in terms of basic insight about what people wanted. And then the language actually catches up. We still talk about a phone and we call it an iPhone, but I mean, how many people do voice on a phone anymore? It's so many other things. It's a handset. It's obviously a computer. It's a payments device. It's so many things. So we have to ask ourselves about whether design thinking can be thought of as a liberal art. Certainly it's an ethos, and certainly it's a method. They're more obvious, but there is this interesting question of a liberal art. And I started off this course by dropping an article on you from myself. I'm actually going to drop another one on you with my frequent research collaborator, Jakub Thestrup. He's younger than me. Actually, he was a Sills student quite a few years ago. He came on exchange from Copenhagen Business School, and then he came back at another time to Japan when he was a double master's degree student between Bocconi in Milan and Copenhagen Business School, and we became good friends when he was back in Tokyo the second time, and we've been doing a whole bunch of things together. And so we wrote an article quite specifically about whether design thinking can be considered a liberal art. It wasn't not the first person to write about this. A very famous guy called Buchanan was exploring this, and there are the links to his article from the website and whatnot, and from Moodle. But I wanted to update that in the context of the discussion of liberal arts education and the internationalization of education, and particularly with the Sills context. So it's not compulsory to read that, but I will load it up and you can see it if you're interested. Design theory, we'll talk a bit about this. Design processes, design thinking that grows out of that. We'll then look in more detail at the IDEO Stanford approach. And then I want to shift gears and I want to bring it over very specifically to communications, and not just a very broad communications definition, because we'll see that what a lot of IDEO does is really about trying to help clients these days actually change corporate dynamics, corporate culture. So there's a lot of internal corporate communication stuff. So IDEO is doing a lot of process and even corporate culture design as consultants. By the way, that's why Hakuhodo kind of effectively bought IDEO Japan's operations, because both Hakuhodo and Dentsu are moving very much into the consulting space. They still make a lot of money off Japanese clients in advertising, probably more than they should. Their margins on their business are huge compared to the global average. But Japanese clients keep paying. But at the same time, although the margins are high, that business is shrinking. So Dentsu and Hakuhodo have a lot of money, actually Dentsu more than Hakuhodo, but both of them have a lot of money, but they're worried that that is going to dry up eventually. So they're trying to use their existing cash flow to move into other businesses. Digitization, of course, is a huge challenge, but also the consulting space is seen to be very rewarding for them. And so their design thinking is one way to get to that. And typically what both of those firms do is that they spend profits on acquisition. So buying the IDEO operations in Tokyo, which still works very closely with IDEO US out of San Francisco, was a strategic move for Hakuhodo. One thing I want to emphasize is the iterative nature of the design process. Iterative just means repeat, okay? Repeat game. So you prototype, you develop something, you test it, maybe you come up with an hypothesis, you test it, you go back, revise, you keep going back, repeat, repeat, repeat. It's not one shot. And I think one of the important reasons why we should be working a little bit of design thinking into the curriculum in the liberal arts program is that all too often students, and I did this as an undergraduate up against a tight deadline as well, tended to turn most of the things I did into one shot exercises. Read the description, one shot at it, submit it, and get a summative assessment, hopefully get the grade you want. Whereas your typical design process is not just creating something in a vacuum, putting out there and hope it works, but constantly going backwards and forwards, checking your assumptions, revising, sometimes completely starting afresh. And lots of studies of the way designers work show this, and that comes through in the content later on. And I'll finish up with a bit more theory. Okay, I was kind of playing with your heads a little bit before when I put the first question about, is it cool? And those of you who already looked at the slides would know that I've got not cool. Actually, it should say not just cool, because I really do think design invariably is cool in the sense that it's a good approach to bring to life in general. So in that sense, I guess it's cool. Also in terms of beautiful, not just in design, but in all problem solving, we often hear aesthetic metaphors used. You'll hear mathematicians talk all the time about a beautiful solution to a problem or an elegant solution to a problem. So something that's very efficient, it's very neat. And the reverse, that if it really looks like you're trying too hard, if you sense them in Japanese, muriyari sa, then it's inelegant, okay? And I guess a simple parallel, and I sometimes use this in the Zemi when we do talk about design thinking in a more applied kind of way in the third semester of my Zemi, is the parallel with a really talented, or a really well-trained or really well-practiced swimmer, someone who's a good swimmer. You know, someone who's a bad swimmer looks like a egg beater, of course, in the water. You know, it's all splashing and effort, and it looks exhausting, and they're hardly making any progress whatsoever. A really talented swimmer just glides through the water. They just make it look so easy. Anyone who's really talented at something always has this sense of ease about them and effortlessness. And it's the kind of effortlessness that comes about from having made an enormous amount of effort, actually. I've got it down to a point where you can no longer see the signs of the struggle. I remember my first ever progress presentation that I gave at Australian National University when I was doing my PhD. Very, very intimidating. A lot of people were so much smarter than me. I was quite happy to admit that I was very much the B team amongst a very smart A team bunch, particularly in the economics and international business and applied policy folks. There are some really quite brilliant people, including the extraordinarily smart guy who came from Oxford, who then when he went to work for Goldman Sachs, created the term BRICS. So the smartest core I ever had. But I remember when I gave my first presentation and I was thinking, you know, it's a PhD. I have to really show how rigorous I am. So massive amounts of data, huge bibliography, lots of theory. And then one of my senpai, one of the senior PhD students said, Mm. Interesting, which was a relief. But he said, but too many signs of the struggle, too many signs of the struggle. I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, a really refined bit of work, when you really got there, it should look obvious. Okay. And I think that in a funny kind of way is why very often universities are pretty bad at communicating themselves to students. That so many of the things, once they are really distilled down, a huge field doing lots of research, lots of debates, ends up with some conclusions that can end up as 4 dot points on a slide. People think, oh yeah, naruhodo, okay? But getting down to that distilled essence is very often a struggle. So design, in some sense, really is a struggle. It is about this starting suppositions, testing them, repeating the process, okay? And if it's done well, yes, you can end up with something that is cool, stylish, and hopefully fashionable, of course, because it resonates. But if we just start with the assumption that everything has to be minimalist, okay, that we just strip things away, then all we do is end up with devices or interfaces that we don't know how to use. There is nothing worse than the hyper minimalist device that's only got one button and is not self-explanatory. And we'll see later on in the course, I'm going to talk a little bit about interface design. And very famously, a writer and speaker and designer by a guy named Norman, Don Norman. He's written a whole bunch of interesting books, design of everyday things and whatnot. You know, he simply says anything should be self-explanatory. If you have to get out the manual to find that the one button on this hyper minimalist, cool looking device, you press it once to do this, two times to do that, 4 times to do something else, then you've got a design problem. I'm a little bit conscious of that with my DJI little pocket video camera that's got a nice gimbal. It is nice and minimalist, but the button, you press it 1, 2, 3, or 4 times. And of course, if you haven't used it every single day, you can never quite remember which one is which. And so you always start off with this experience of press, 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 press. It was no accident that cars in the 60s and 70s had a whole lot of buttons with labels on them, because the designers at the time thought when you're driving a car at 100 kilometers an hour, you shouldn't be trying to figure out how many times you have to press a button and start experimenting to navigate through a menu. So we want to be very cautious about this. Just make it simple, make it minimalist, because there is vacuous kind of minimalism as well. Apple generally works very, very hard to get down to a minimalist interface. Sometimes I think they go a little bit too far. You know, you do sometimes have to kind of Google and find out how the heck you actually do something basic, because they've buried it in a too minimal interface. It is certainly true that designers have a strong orientation to visual communication, and they use visualizing as a key thinking and your analytical and problem-solving tool. And I do think that this is something that's very much missing in the liberal arts, as it's at least interpreted in Waseda, in SILS, and quite a few other places. The classics professors often emphasized text, even though some of their fellow classics researchers were working in art history, for example. But in actually some of the very prominent liberal arts colleges in the United States, there's a very strong emphasis on aesthetics as well. And whether that then carries over to an application to using aesthetics or an aesthetic perspective for understanding, for knowledge creation and knowledge communication, that's another question we'll come back to. So yes, aesthetics matter, but we shouldn't reduce things just simply to aesthetics. Okay. So we have to talk about problem solving, but talk about problem solving not just in the way we tend to think of problem solving coming out of the social sciences, you know, that there's plastic bags floating in the ocean and dolphins get choked or something like that. So how can you solve these issues? Okay, all of those are very valid problems to work on. But when we look about art and design fields, we see that they use the discourse of problems in a broader way, that this is often a deep philosophical problem or an existential problem. It's often people would say that it's a big philosophical issue. Okay, so a lot of design, art, and as I say, or other creative endeavors can be understood as problem solving if your definition of a problem is sufficiently broad enough. Okay, and so there's problem specification, identifying a problem that hasn't really been taken seriously by others and trying to get people to engage with it. So one of the really striking things we see, for example, is that a lot of the issues of civil rights, for example, of racism, have been very often first effectively confronted through creative endeavors. It's through art, it's through literature, for example. And we do see some people who devoted their whole life to political philosophy and in the direction of social change coming to recognize that actually philosophers and political scientists haven't been very successful in changing the world and making the world a better place, that the better way to do this is actually through the documentary, through the film, through literature, traditionally. Getting people to read a book is a challenge these days. Richard Rorty, who we'll talk about in the context of redescription, passed away a number of years back, but a very prominent political theorist, one of the most prominent American political theorists of the last few decades. He eventually left the philosophy department where he was and moved to a literature department because he arrived at the conclusion that if you really want to change the world, you actually had to use more powerful descriptions that moved people. I'd suggest, for example, that abstract discussions of human rights in relation to, say, the history of racism in the United States isn't going to resonate so much with people who don't start out with in an empathetic mindset. On the other hand, if you see a film such as The Green Book, an astonishing film I watched several times, The Green Book, that just simply brings to light the perversities of historical racism, in that particular case of a hugely talented African-American pianist who travels to the southern states and is performing for white audiences, but not allowed to eat with them, for example, and not allowed to stay in the hotels that white people could stay in. So the cinematographic depiction can often speak more dramatically to people's empathetic side. And when we start to talk about design thinking from an IDEO perspective, you'll notice that their whole bootleg kit there, their kit on design thinking starts with how to be empathetic, okay? How to get in the shoes, the hearts of others, for example. So also when we talk about problem solving, one of the problems with the discourse is it suggests that actually the problems get solved. The problem solved, okay, we've solved that, we move on. Many of the really big problems that artists and designers work on are never solved. They're partially resolved. We get somewhere there. But for the most part, problems are never completely solved. Also, why so much work falls out of fashion is that it's not that it's wrong, it's just simply the problems were no longer very interesting. As I say here, philosophers, artists and others turn away from topics and approaches when they fail to deliver valuable insight, less often because they were proven against some shared criteria to be mistaken, that just simply there are bigger issues to be concerned about. And one of the striking things, of course, and it's very important from communications, is getting traction, getting attention. How can you engage people when there are bigger issues there? You may have noticed now that discussions of global warming and environmental sustainability, the audience resonate with that? Does it make the top news? Not in the context of a global pandemic with a massive economic dislocation and human costs. So we can only feel pain. Well, actually, some people say we can only feel pain in one place at a time. I don't suggest you stab yourself to try and distract yourself from a headache, but clearly breaking through and getting attention when people have bigger fish to fry, bigger problems to deal with. So this is a question then of really what problems are more worthwhile or worth demanding of our attention. So a lot of art and design criticism comes down to saying whether the problem the artist or designer has defined is one that's interesting and valuable. Because in the end, there's nothing worse from the point of view of a researcher or an artist or a designer or whatever to have people say, yeah, okay, well, yeah, you made an effort, but so what? You know, so what is pretty crushing when you've devoted an enormous amount of effort to it. By the way, the rudest comment I've ever heard to a PhD in progress presentation was at the Australian National University, and it was a Japanese researcher who came from Osaka, and after the student presented his work, fellow Japanese student presented his work that he'd been working on for 1.5 years, the guy went, yeah, so what? So did he. And I thought they were going to beat, the student was going to beat him up or commit suicide or something subsequently. So this getting feedback early on about whether this problem is even worthwhile working on is really important. This idea of that you just slave away and then bring it to the world fully formed is an extraordinarily dangerous thing, because it may be far too way ahead of its time. It may be far beyond its time. You may have missed it. It may have never had a time. Who knows? I just got one picture I've had on file for a while. I exhibited this 2012 Tokyo Fashion Week. Was it of the time? Was it significant? Was it an interesting problem? I don't know. I mean, a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads. I don't think he could scratch his head in that outfit. Maybe it's interesting. I certainly get the inspiration. Is it a good problem to work on? Who knows? Okay. Then when we speak very specifically about design problems, it's a little counterintuitive for students, but often when they start studying design and design theory, you suddenly get told all about different degrees of problem, okay? And that the problems that designers, top tier designers, should be aiming to work at. And generally designers are not so interested in the well-defined problems. This is where the goals are already well specified. Then it's actually seeking means to achieve those goals within evident constraints. So it's really important. It's kind of ho-hum or humdrum kind of design. You know, two people, two adults, 3 kids, block of land, need a new house done, got what we call a program, a list of basic needs, and the sun, as usual, comes up in the east, sets in the west, but we're in a place where the western sun is incredibly hot. Okay, so how do you take a fairly stock standard program for a bit of house and for a bit of housing, and you orient to the site? Those problems are well defined. Now, that said, I mean, immediately that should ring alarm bells. So you're like, hang on, my house faces west and I cook in it. And it's cold in the winter in the morning because I get no sun, and I boil in the summer in the afternoon. Then immediately that should be telling you that actually the world is full of well-defined problems with actually well-defined answers, but nonetheless, people choose to ignore those answers. So yes, mediocrity, let me say utter shittedness, just crap design, bad practice is rife, okay? Never underestimate the extent of just sheer piss poor, mediocre performance out there in the world, which leaves designers endlessly just shaking their heads. You know, architecture students, you know, they don't really want it to be assigned a very stock standard, you know, bit of housing, bit of a house draw up, you know, design exercise. They want to be challenged for something bigger. But the irony there is that something like 98% of all the housing stock in a country like Japan is actually not just designed for site, but not actually chosen in a site specific kind of way. So it's just like, here's the plan, here's the vote, like a little monopoly greenhouse plonked down on the site, kind of regardless of orientation and whatnot. So in so many ways, we see this fittedness for purpose to an existing problem. Where design gets more interesting is actually thinking about ill-defined problems, where the ends to a solution are not really known, or even the means. You actually have to go through a process of discovering how to solve this problem in the design process itself. So there is this problem definition and redefinition of refining the definition of what the problem is. Now, actually, you've all had lots of experiences of this. If you just simply trying to make your bedroom work in a better way, if it's really messy, if you can't pop down to the home store, maybe it's late at night, maybe you can't because there's been a lockdown because of COVID-19 or whatever, and you just have to make the most of what's at hand. It's kind of messy. You're not even quite sure what you're trying to realize. You haven't started with this very clear vision of how your room is going to look once you rearrange it, but you are going to pimp your room. You're going to rework it, okay, and come up with a whole bunch of solutions as you go. They're nice challenges. I mean, some people really enjoy that. Some people hate it. Generally interesting work is this. And it's often incredibly resource constrained. We can think of this as the kind of wire and string approach to design. And if you want an interesting example of this, Google it. I'll try and find a link too. There's a television series which looked at Aboriginal Australians, so remote communities in Australia, the bush mechanic, and how they kept their cars on the road and all the workarounds they had. You get a flat tire, you pull the tire off, and you rip up a whole lot of grass that grows in the desert. You stuff the tire with grass and put it back on, and you can get driving again. All these kind of workarounds, these kind of desert island kind of workarounds, Robinson Crusoe kind of approach has this kind of, ill-defined problem aspect. Of course, there are basic needs that we understand that are well-defined: shelter, food, those kind of things, water supply. But then there's a whole bunch of things that are not. There's this third category of wicked problems. And this is the Buchanan-Reed I've mentioned, it touches on. So problems that are not clearly specified, they even defy attempts to actually specify them. Certainly they defy attempts to do them in advance. And as you go through the design process, you actually unleash more issues, more and more and more. Okay, so additional questions leading to a continual reformulation. This is also the case in negotiations sometimes, that you start off with two clear positions, people are conflicting, and those of you in intermediate seminar know about this, positional bargaining. But if you can have a really honest mutual exchange, you often find that the issues are rather different, the underlying issues. It's actually like marriage counseling and whatnot, that there's a whole bunch of much deeper issues that you have to dig out and wrestle with an vastly different set of potential solutions to what you thought might be when you started to approach the ostensible problem in the first case. One of the really significant things with wicked problems is what I mentioned before, that there is no stopping rule. You don't say, okay, we've resolved this, we've drawn neat boundaries around the problem, and it's all done with. And very significantly, and this is a huge challenge to people who are trained in the classic kind of cram school, Duke-N kind of approach, there is not a single answer. And when we look at different fields of knowledge, one of the most striking things about design and design thinking is that it really emphasizes that there are multiple acceptable ways to solve this problem. And so it's actually about picking from a range of possible answers. Now, if you think about actually how our education system works, these are very rare. And especially in the Japanese context, in a number of other countries with competitive entrance exams, we set problems that have one answer. Ideally, that can actually be examined with a mark sheet, so we can take all those answers and put them through for a double run and double check that we don't get any errors. Score people, rank them, draw a line, tell them in 5 days you're in or you're out. Okay, so closed problems. a lot of the big issues, the stubborn issues that don't go away in society, are not closed problems. And if you just start to find the answer, you discover that there is no the answer, there are multiple answers. And then you come down to often a range of what we call normative or value judgments about the relative preference of an answer. So let's briefly think about design thinking as a liberal art, as an ethos, and as a method, okay? To quote Richard Buchanan here, we've seen design grow from a trade activity. This is like in the Middle Ages, you know, the stonemasons who were making Notre Dame, for example. Sometimes they work from drawings, and actually drawings in the past mattered when lots of workers were illiterate. The visual representation was very significant. It's later on when you've got universal education that you can actually go towards more text-based. But also they were very often working from 3D models or also from mental images of what they wanted to realize. But they were very artisanal. It was very much shokunin santeki. And indeed architecture, which is now one of the quintessential very intellectual university-based professions, and unless you graduate from an architecture program, you can't be admitted as an architect in most countries. But until even 50 years ago in a number of countries, this was actually treated as more of a kind of apprenticeship, okay? So it's moved from a trade activity to a segmented profession that is strict boundaries. You're a designer. And one of the other things that I've written with Jakob Thestrup, another article that we published recently, is this definitional question of when am I a designer yet? At what point can you call yourself a designer? Is it when you get something built? Is it when you've graduated from design school and you've got a degree that says I'm a designer? And this is significant in relation to the D school that we're talking about. Because when David Kelly and his brother Tom, who heads IDEO here in Tokyo, was senior advisor, when David Kelly was talking to Stanford about creating the D School and he lined up a huge donor, he went to talk to Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs said, oh God, yes, we need lots of design thinking, design education. But for God's sake, we don't need more people with a degree that allowing themselves to walk around saying, I'm a designer. Don't do that. So you should create a design school that offers no degree. And so the D school, you do not get a degree or even a major in design thinking. You have to be enrolled in another program. You can be in biotech, you can be in religion, you can be in any field. And then you go and take design thinking classes in the D school. So it's really about this general attribute of design thinking rather than turning out a segmented profession of designers, self-referential designers. By the way, there are issues of the way architects relate to design in general, because design is then a subset, architecture is a subset of design, more strictly boarded and very tough tests for admission into the professional association, for example. But then, so this segmented profession, and then it became a field for technical research. So you've got a whole surrounding academic field of design and design studies. And then Buchanan said back in 1992, it should be recognized as a new liberal art of technological culture, that we are so much focused on using technology to find solutions to problems, but we have to overlay this gakusei teki, this very liberal, multidisciplinary design thinking approach to generate the problems that we then seek the technical solutions to. By the way, if ever you're in an argument, someone says, yes, we'll come back to that later, that's just a detail, be respectful for that response. A lot of people want to lead with the detail, especially people who are not on top of it. People, they want to demonstrate that, yes, I'm keen to, eager to help. And so they jump in with a very specific detail, but details are just details. They can be sorted later. One bit of advice on this: when there are big issues to be dealt with, don't be that annoying person who always constantly in the middle of a conversation reaches for the phone and Googles. These days, any idiot can Google something, okay? So the time for Googling, for checking details is afterwards. The earlier period of the ideating, of working through the bigger issues, is the important stage. And if you just throw in too many details, it can disrupt a process. So let's talk about a couple of terms very briefly. Ethos, the characteristic spirit of a culture, era, or community as manifested in its attitudes and aspirations. So we'll see that design is very much an ethos in some respects. It's a method, particular procedure for accomplishing or approaching something. We'll talk a bit about this, and particularly episodic approach. Highly systematized in large design firms. It has to be. They have a client come in, they've got something to work on, they have to manage the time, they have to commit a number of staff to do this, so it has to be systematized. And also a methodology, which can be encoded, it can be written down, it can be shared, and the D School and IDEO have both done this for us. So a little bit of vocabulary. A very important notion is emergent properties, okay? The problem and the solution are revealed simultaneously through the design process. This parallels the attention given to complexity and complex systems. And you hear a lot about this in the social sciences now, that really until about 20 or 30 years ago, many of our models of the world were closed models. They assumed stable states. All we had to do was figure out how the world worked. If X causes Y, then okay, we can act on X to get this result we want from Y. Now we've realized that actually the world has very complex emergent properties, that prediction is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And we are very much in an exploratory stage of understanding these complex interdependencies. One of the reasons for the debates over climate change is it's actually an extraordinarily complex set of system dynamics. By comparison, figuring out gravity and how to fire a rocket into space and to have a space shuttle dock with a space station is relatively simple by comparison with figuring out the complexities of climate change, for example. Sounds a bit counterintuitive, but anyway. So this emergent properties, we don't know what we're going to end up with, but we have this process and we're kind of confident in the process, and therefore we'll live with what it leads to. People also speak of a design proposition. What this tells us again is that there isn't the answer, but there is a proposition. And it's tentative, it's subject to feedback in an iterative kind of way, and the proposition is open to being revised. Also, people will talk about a persuasive solution or not. Not right or wrong, it's just, do I find it persuasive? It's a modest response because it acknowledges that you yourself may have cognitive perception biases, you may have knowledge limitations from your own cultural standpoint, for example. Do you find it persuasive or not? So this is a common discourse. You really annoy designers to say, that's wrong. I mean, that's wrong. You think it's wrong, okay? I don't think it's wrong. And we get nowhere with two people saying, wrong, you're wrong, I'm wrong. No, I'm not wrong, you're wrong, okay? So this notion of something being more or less persuasive is a better way to speak. And in terms of resolution, this is a key bit of language. Once we have defined the boundaries of our problem, and invariably it's about drawing limits to how big a problem we can work on. How well have we resolved all of those contending imperatives, all those different things we would like to achieve? Low cost, high functionality, high resilience, make it beautiful, all of those kind of things. To what degree have we resolved them through a proposition that is the best available to us given the resource constraints, including time, that we have? So let me have a very quick drink. I'm conscious the mic is on. I'll roll out of there. Okay. A very important thing to understand, of course, is that all professions have their own cultures. If you study medicine, it has its own very distinctive culture. Design, of course, professional designers have their own culture, but it spills over from the designers themselves, because so many people work with designers and become more and more acculturated to that. Design thinking to some degree is about spreading a design culture to people who don't understand themselves as designers, who make themselves comfortable in that culture. One of the best essays, and it's more than an essay, because actually it's a framework, it's a rubric, it's a very nice mapping of the issues, is by a writer called Nigel Cross, Designerly Ways of Knowing. This article came about because the United Kingdom was going through a process of reviewing its higher education and looking at the status of design as part of a higher education curriculum. Now, don't underestimate the conservatism historically in universities in what was considered appropriate fields of knowledge for the university. I remember when I was at the University of Queensland as a first-year undergraduate student, my major was journalism. And I remember snobbish friends of mine, the snobby ones always went to the fancy private schools, and I thought they knew everything. And those who came from the state schools generally were better students, but lacking in confidence. And so I remember these kind of snobby grammar kids saying, journalism, isn't that like learning to be a butcher or something like that? Shouldn't you just do that as an apprentice? Why are you teaching that in a university? Similarly, when they brought nursing into universities, of course, the reply was, well, engineering is very applied. Dentistry is applied. Actually, medicine is incredibly applied. And if it wasn't, you wouldn't dare go to a doctor who was a graduate from the university. Every single time the fields of applied practice brought into higher education, there is controversy. Does this really belong in a university or not? It's all very ironic, because actually one of the foundational fields in the medieval university was actually medicine. Some of the oldest universities around, such as Bologna in Italy, clearly started in a more applied way. And indeed, the very early liberal arts were really understood as about training people for the priesthood. So people went to the colleges of Oxford, Cambridge, and some of the other great medieval universities before they had a career in the priesthood or in teaching, which are all applied activities. There's this idea that you had to have a knowledge field. So it's always been kind of contentious. So particularly with the bringing of design schools into the university curriculum, they had to figure out, okay, well, how designers make sense of the world, and how does that differ from the scientists and the humanities, for example? So this article specified this, and we'll talk about it. But core design values, and this was about going back out and looking at what actually designers did, and then trying to articulate this in terms of a university education. So core design values: empathy, practicality, appropriateness, ingenuity. For the humanities, it's much more kind of justice, commitment, imagination, and more recent word, subjectivity, how the individuals experience the world. For the sciences, truth, objectivity, rationality, and neutrality. I'll say straight away that many of the most difficult problems in the world that have kind of defied resolution, ongoing conflicts, for example, the Arab-Israeli dispute. My own personal view on that is because the lawyers dominate so much of the debate about that it's always reduced to issues of rights and law, and that just never gets you very far. That actually, if you brought designers and maybe poets and artists to bear on it, you may actually move closer to resolution. Because as soon as you succumb to a rights-based view, it's very difficult, particularly if people have contending claims on rights. It's extraordinarily difficult to come up with a practical resolution, because everything is seen as an abrogation of one's rights. I've just got this picture of Pecha Kucha night. If you know about Pecha Kucha, good. If you don't, Google pechakucha.org. It's a way of organizing presentations, as some of you taken my classes know all about this. It was actually developed by two architects here in Tokyo, although they're not Japanese, and it's become a format for doing very interesting presentations the world over. It very much reflects the way architects like to work. It's a format where you do 20 slides, 20 seconds, you per slide in a fixed way, you present your stuff, and then you interact. This goes back to the tradition in design skills of the critique or the crit, where you show your work regularly. You're normally standing up, it's pinned to the wall, students huddle in close. There is this feedback, which can be quite intimidating because it's quite public. Everyone knows, it was in no two minds about what the lecturer thinks of a student's work, for example. So that can be intimidating, but is a very significant skill. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the theory, and I also want to say, in terms of communication theories, I've got 2 videos I actually shot a week and a half ago, but I just haven't had a chance to edit. I will put up later this evening. I'll also do another overview video later on some of that stuff we've got on the communication theory, but I won't be taking up the live session time to do it. I'm very conscious even today is very one way. A little bit overview of the theories I've got here. So early theoretical explanations of design saw it as entailing problem solving through fresh associations of established elements, okay? And it was kind of black boxing the brain. This is happening somewhere in people's brain, but we don't even know how the brain works, so we don't want to go there. And those of you interested in the history of knowledge, this was the behavioral thing. Unless you could actually observe how people did it and measured it, post-war American approach, what we call positivist approach, then they didn't want to go there. So trying to avoid second guessing what was going on in people's heads. Now, moved away from that, more focused about how people think. Often this is involved in participant observant strategies or interview strategies. Also looking at how people process information, decision-making, and whatnot. So just bring it back to this discussion of the different fields and how they process knowledge in different ways. Scientific problem solving tends to be very analysis oriented, and we're really deeply acculturated to this, finding the hidden or the underlying rules that govern a particular dynamic. I figured out what causes this, or how the world works or whatever. So it's very much about a breaking down into elements. You start with a data set, and then you find the universal rules lurking beneath them about the causality of things. Designers are working in a much more synthesis-oriented way. As I say here, assembling identified elements to propose a coherent whole. Some people instinctively work a bit more this way. You like to make the connections, sometimes a bit Modigliani. If you're one of these people who like to pull things together and draw disparate connections, you're probably doing design thinking without actually realizing it, okay? So in a more syncretic kind of synthesis-oriented kind of way. Now, of course, both design and scientific endeavor has elements of both. So what's design thinking about? Well, it's purposive. You've got a clear goal. You don't just do it in this abstract explorative thing. It's intentional. This is a key thing with design. It always has some intention. It's deliberate. It's future-oriented. It's inherently optimistic. That's the critical thing about design. If you don't think you can make the world a better place, you shouldn't be in design, because that's really what design is. It's about, I tend to think of design as reducing the number of things that are needlessly crap, okay? Because there's a lot of really crap things out there in the world. And the designerly instinct is very much to come along and say, that's pretty feeble, that's pretty sad. I'm sure there's a better way to do this. So if your inclination is to be like this, you're actually extraordinarily suited to design. It's solution focused, you want to make the world better. Usually doesn't start with a well-specified problem. It's more like, this is not working, is it? Let's figure out some way to make it better, okay? Problems are often, the parameters of the problem are not defined, as we've spoken about, unlike well-planned scientific experiments. We're going to test this drug on 500 rats, There's a very clear methodology there. And it's not a simple linear process from a problem specification to a final resolution. It's much more iterative, as I said. where the problem is better defined through solution seeking, prototyping, testing with the users, target audience. This really is like rearranging things in your apartment. You drag it all around, you try, try this, try that, throw that out, challenge some of your assumptions. What if we got rid of the table? Do we really need a table? Yeah, seriously? No, let's get rid of the table. Throw the table out. Wow, suddenly new potentialities emerge, okay? So you've all done design thinking. And very often, the most creative stuff comes from the biggest constraints, okay? So at the same time, it's normally done in response to a client who's going to pay you, and they do have a purpose. So you have to specify the task, okay? If it's over-specified in the beginning, if it's too narrow, you're not going to find a whole range of potential solutions. You have to make sure you understand how the client understands what they want. One of the biggest challenges actually with for designers is really cutting through what designers say about their needs and really finding what their deep needs are. Because partly for pride reasons, partly because people are just simply not trained to talk about their needs. People are not very good at putting their needs into words. So if you've got issues in your main relationship now, it may be just because the other person's not so good at talking about themselves. And if you can patiently work with them, maybe you can get to a better place, okay? In the case of corporate communications, we need a strong understanding of the target audience and the intended effect on them. And it's not enough, of course, that when we speak to an audience and it resonates with them, it's got to lead to some action or inclination, some proclivity for action that we want. Yeah, because we're going to spend money or effort to communicate to people and to design this in a sophisticated way. Now, key thing with design thinking is design in general. There's two different ways of thinking, divergent and convergent thinking. The divergent thinking, you've often heard about thinking outside the box, okay? Maybe you've heard of ideating, brainstorming. This is trying to get as many fresh perspectives and ideas out there, okay? This ideating stage is hugely important. And you mustn't rush to judgment. And people participating have to feel free to say whatever you want. I never forget when, in a conversation in SILS about creating a new graduate school, and we had this idea sharing session, and I knew about the D school at Stanford. So I said, has anyone thought about a graduate school without a degree? And I won't name the professor, still works for SILS, went, ha? Pakajinai nani tenda? I'm like, Domo, thanks very much. But I said, just having a thought bubble, imagine we were a bar. We're a place where people could do study, but to get a degree, some other famous university like Stanford or Australian National University or whatever, Oxford, take your pick, ETH, whatever, CBS, would say, okay, we feel you are sufficiently well educated at a mixture of, say, Waseda and our institution that you can have our degree. And that would create a huge pressure on us to do really good education to meet someone else's standards, which would also lift the Waseda brand. So I thought it was a kind of interesting idea. But of course, I was like, a hawker. So it never went anywhere. I'm like, okay, fair enough. Not very good ideating. I knew it was never going to happen. But lesson one in how not to do ideation. So you have to not only be open to all kind of out there ideas, but also unclear expression. You know, it's people are going to and and always be very suspicious of ideas that are very neatly expressed, because they're probably not very fresh. They're not very new, or the person has thought so much about them, they've distilled them down to a really simple way, and they've left all the complexity and the nuance out of the process. And often they're more interested in winning the argument or being responsible for coming up with the idea. And so they've decided to fix on a simple, easy to sell kind of idea. So be suspicious of too simple, too persuasive stories. So you have brainstorming out there, then you go to convergent thinking. divergent, and then you're convergent. You synthesize and solution-oriented process. And you can see through the material from the D School on that. The iterative design process just simply emphasizes, as I say here, that it's episodic, okay? And this is, I'm not going to go through this. Researchers have shown that designers tend to move backwards and forwards in terms of the process of more divergent thinking and then more convergent. And one of the interesting findings is that really good designers with a lot of experience tend to stick with a concept even when it's getting difficult, because actually at the point of the difficulties, it forces them to resolution. Also, if you don't have an initial concept to run with, it's kind of everywhere and nowhere, which is quite a dangerous thing. You work forever and then you've got nothing to show for it. So sticking with a concept through difficult periods and finding a way to make that concept work is often the most efficient way to get to the end. Research shows that as the problem's more defined, it's less episodic, less jumping backwards and forwards between the divergent and the convergent and the testing. That once things fall into place, then it's often a very quick resolution of the details. That's when the interns get put in architecture to get put onto the modeling and filling in the drain pipe, drawing the drain pipes and the stairs and all those kind of things. Okay, so what do we see with this process of resolution? That generally the designer brings their own particular organizing principles to an underspecified problem, okay? Might have a distinctive style, or sometimes if you haven't yet developed your style, it'll be in response to the project. And this is a really important point. The more experience you have, the projects help you to develop your own style. You don't arrive fully formed as a designer. You have to work on projects to discover what your approach is. So you have some principles, and then you also have a project-specific idea. You can't just apply the same solution to everything. Lazy consultancy firms do this, but there's a huge backlash now from clients. Very importantly, design is normative. It's judgments on what the design outcome should be, okay? And invariably, you are blinded to some alternatives. That's not an entirely bad thing, because if you spend all of your time looking at all the options, you'll never make any progress. Now, a key takeaway is constraints actually improve design, whether it's budget, deadline, program, values, all of these things. What makes things difficult makes for better design. An architect friend of mine said, used to work for Rem Koolhaas in Office of Metropolitan Architecture, that, you know, you get a wealthy client, comes in, flat site, lots of money, no idea about architecture, pretty easy programmatic brief. The architects aren't going to work too hard to come up with something really innovative because they don't have to. So what makes it difficult for you probably makes it you better as a professional in so many fields, and the outcome better. So a bit on IDEO and the Stanford approach from the two of them. I really want you to work through this yourself, because the material is so easily accessible, and you can download the full 90-page interface. But really importantly, they emphasize creativity from all for all. It's not elite designers doing this for other people. It's that everyone can be a designer. That's the key takeaway here. Creativity is something you practice, not just a talent you're born with. And the Kelly brothers have written a great book called Creative Confidence, which is actually one of the books we read in my third Zemi. And I have on my shelf up there a copy signed by Tom Kelly, okay, and strongly recommend if you're interested to read the book. And design thinking is seen as for social change. So IDEO makes a lot of stuff available for free, as does the D School, as I've spoken about. The ideating processes we've already talked about here. I'll just put them up here again in relation to Brand Japan, getting all of those ideas out here. But I've just put it here because I want to show you just a simple example that the way you manage the ideating process can have an impact. The first couple of years, I just said, get in your groups and write down everything and bring back and report all the different ideas you have. And some of them are childish, a whole bunch of things about Japan, delicate, beautiful, work, sexist, racist, a whole bunch of things. Quirky still pops up. Okay. Then 2017, interesting effect. I really was struck by this. When I told each group limited to 3 words, when I said only 3 words per group, what happened? Dramatically reduced the negative words. When people had to make a choice, they selected positive words. And that's not really a good thing, because if you're trying to implement Japan branding campaigns, you have to recognize that there are a lot of negative perceptions out there as well. Just pretending they're not there and just blithely putting positive stuff out means that you might actually annoy your audience. At very least, you considered to be kooky or minai, that you can't understand the particular context or the environment. So the decision rule we apply can often have a very significant impact on how the ideating process works. Okay, so skip through that. Some people pride themselves on being the devil's advocate, the doubter, the critical person in the group. Under some circumstances, this is great. You know, speak truth to power, confront the boss, the president, or whatever. That's good. But if you have someone who's always a front foot kind of person who does this in an ideating session, they can actually inhibit brainstorming, which can be a real problem. IDEO talks a fair bit about prototyping. Our concern is with communications. We're not obviously making design products, but you can prototype text as well, just like, you know, films are screened with audiences. This is actually done with advertising copy, very often testing with focus groups, for example, to see reactions. So this idea of rough and ready, very quickly, test with an audience in a very iterative kind of way. And I'll skip through this. Now, I just want to briefly speak to it, because you can engage with this yourselves, and I'm very conscious I've only got a few minutes to go. How traditional advertising has worked. Advertising is only one set of corporate communication design, of course. There's a lot of the internal communications we've spoken about, whatnot. But there's a couple of very prominent texts around which still very much influence practice in the advertising industry. James Webb Young is most influential. Actually, one of my former emissaires, when he joined one of the big 4 Kokokugaisha, all of the new employees were given a copy of this book in Japanese. And he said, yokatta ne, mo DCC de su ni mo benkyou shiteru ne. So he kind of knew straight away. It's way back from 1960. But this, it's still kind of the Bible. It's a really tiny book, although it still sells for 1,500 yen. The guy's grandkids must be rich based off this book, okay, that he wrote a long time ago. So his big thing about was, how do you generate good catch copy? So he suggested this is really straightforward. In the production of ideas, the mind follows a method which is just as definite as the method by which, say, forwards are produced. Very confident. Bit too optimistic in some ways, but nonetheless has a very good element to it. He says, while simple to state, it actually requires the hardest kind of intellectual work to follow. It's a principle and a method. He says, first of all, an idea is a new combination of old elements, and it's a capacity to bring old elements into new combinations depends largely on the ability to see relationships. So you can see that this is very much architectural or design oriented, in that you're not discovering an underlying truth so much as in a very synthesizing way, tapping a multiplicity of truths. And there's no single right answer. There's no, yes, this is the Platonic ideal. This is the perfect example in heaven of that catch copy for selling Coca-Cola, for example. So his approach, 5 steps of idea formation. Raw material. You really immerse yourself deeply in everything that's being done in the field. Your competitors' products, know all about the product. Okay, he says that's like kaleidoscope-like. Have general knowledge as well too, and this is a great defense of the role of the liberal arts. Work it over in your mind, download all reactions, half-formed impressions, till you run out of thoughtful possibility. Drop the subject, go and do something else interesting, okay? And then the kind of eureka moment, then the idea will appear when you least expect it, expect it. In my case, I always get my best ideas in the shower, which is always a problem, which has me come stepping out wet with a towel saying, you know, Carmi, where's a pen, where's a paper before I forget it, okay? Writing it down. So putting your idea in the world and working very hard to resolve all the barriers to using it for your purposes. And he says fundamentally that good ideas have self-expanding properties. And if you think about it, if you've had this, once you kind of get it, there is this exciting thing where you get momentum. Yes, yes, and then this and this and this and this. Now, very often they're dead ends. They actually turn out to be not as good as you thought. But it can be exhilarating. It can be incredibly exciting to work in any team or even as an individual doing this ideating kind of process. I'll let you read this yourself. Other than to just simply summarize it, David Ogilvy, the great founder of Ogilvy and Mather, he very explicitly says that he was not a very good writer, but he's a good self-editor. And a man after my own heart. I love rum, and he was a connoisseur of fine rums. And he says, number 9 there, if all else fails, I drink half a bottle of rum and play a Handel oratorio on the gramophone. This is from a long time ago. Generally produces an uncontrollable gush of copy. Then he gets up in the morning, edits himself. Okay, so this is very famously how he went through the process. I'd like you to engage with that. Looking at our time, I think this is the place to leave it, and I will pick up on this at the beginning of next week because it carries over very well into the process of redescription. David Ogilvy, in his very famous book, has a set of rules about what makes for good corporate communications, good advertising, good copy. Okay, he really emphasized have a great idea, learn from what certainly works, and a really significant thing that he kept emphasizing to his staff is if it works, keep using it. He would have loved Soda Kyoto Iko. It works. Don't mess with what works, okay? Keep using good copy. For many products, the actual customers are new, and this is a really important point. On average, people in Japan buy a car once every 8 years, okay? What the copy you used to sell the car last year will work this year because they're new customers, okay? It's not that the people bought a car last year and this year they want to hear something different when they buy their next car. That doesn't work. So there's a whole bunch of things here. We'll leave it here. We'll pick up on this next week. You'll see that the first set of examples relevant to our topic on the website next week under topic 10 is actually KonMari, without doubt the most influential Japanese abroad, quite an interesting thing, on tidying up. And I very deliberately use that there, and we'll have a bit of a think about how redescription can actually work in so many domains of our lives, okay? And we'll do a little bit of a breakout session, and I'll throw a topic in there that I will flag to you in advance so you can think about. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, and it's a beautiful afternoon. Get out and enjoy the rest of it if you don't have a period 5 class, because it seems to me that the rainy season is about to be upon us for the next week, looking at the forecast. So thank you for your forbearance.